Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Beatles Forever. We've been following the relationship of John Lennon and Cynthia Lennon through her book, John. It's been an interesting experience to see how Beatlemania and Cynthia's relationship to John were put in her own words. So today we're going to find out why the relationship ended. The last video had John suggesting that Cynthia go off to Greece for 2 weeks, and Cynthia mulled it over and felt like it might make him miss her if she did. Cynthia said that when she left John, he was laying in their bed in a trance-like state. But that wasn't unusual, and she said he barely turned his head to say goodbye. So Cynthia enjoyed her vacation nonetheless. Her spirits were raised being among friends, and she said she really missed John, and she felt that they could make a fresh start, and she was full of energy, making plans and picturing her and John together. Well, John's view of marriage was different. Cynthia stated that John didn't have a good view of marriage because he had never seen his parents together. When he was 5, his father abandoned him, and his mother sort of did too. So John's father had that same thing happen to him too. Cynthia said that the kids often repeat the mistakes of their parents, so she should have known John might do the same thing to her and Julian, but she was young and optimistic. And she had phoned John to say she was coming home. She said she had her friends Alex and Jeannie with her, and they arrived at the house at 4 in the afternoon. Cynthia felt something wasn't right. The porch light was on, the curtains were drawn, and it was quiet. The housekeeper wasn't there, and no Julian. The front door was unlocked, and the three of them went in calling out. Cynthia felt like it was a prank and that they would jump out of hiding and start laughing at their joke. But then Cynthia started to feel fear, so she made herself open the sunroom door, and when she did, the curtains were closed and the room was dimly lit. And she saw John and Yoko sitting on the floor cross-legged, facing each other. Next to them was a table of dirty dishes. They were wearing toweled robes that were kept in the pool house, so she thought they must have gone for a swim. So John was facing her, and he looked at her with no expression on his face. And Cynthia managed to say, "Oh, hi," and Yoko didn't look around. Cynthia tried to act like things were normal. She felt like she was the intruder. And Cynthia felt like they had arranged it so that she would find him the way that she did. So John's betrayal was hard for Cynthia to comprehend. She felt that the wall that they had built around each other, John and Yoko, that is, and she didn't imagine that Yoko could do that. So Cynthia ran out of the room. She grabbed a few of her things and put them in a bag and ran downstairs. She said she was barely in the house 20 minutes after entering the house that she ran out in a taxi with Jeannie, her friend, and Alex, leaving John and his lover behind. So Cynthia left and went to Alex and Jenny's house. And when she arrived at Jenny and Alex's home, Jenny and Alex were roommates, and Jenny said she needed to go to bed, and she said all of it was too much for her to handle. Cynthia then went to the sitting room, and she collapsed on the sofa, and she called the housekeeper to check on Julian, and she was happy he was with her and her family. Cynthia felt confused and didn't know what was real anymore. All kinds of thoughts were going through her head, which was perfectly normal for anyone going through what she had gone through. So what would happen to her and Julian? She wondered how long had John and Yoko been sleeping with each other. And she knew that then that John had sent her away so that he could be with Yoko. So Alex came in and said he thought she needed a drink, and he got some red wine and got 2 glasses, and they went through 2 bottles of wine. Cynthia then said Alex shocked her by saying he was in love with her, and why didn't they run away together? Cynthia said she only had a few £100s in her bank, no riches. She then went to the bathroom and got sick. After that, she collapsed on the bed fully clothed and passed out. And later, Alex crept into the bed and was trying to kiss her and whispering they should be together. Cynthia pushed him away. He was supposedly John's friend. Cynthia spent a few days at their house, even though she didn't feel comfortable there. She didn't have anywhere else to go. And after a few days, she knew she had to go home. And she knew that Julian needed her, and Julian needed John. So back home, when Cynthia returned home, the house seemed to be back to normal. Dot, the housekeeper, was there, and so was Julian. John came out of the den and said, "Oh, hi," and he asked her where she'd been. And Cynthia stared at him, thinking he had to be kidding. So Cynthia didn't want to say anything in front of Julian, so for a few hours she tried to act like things were normal. Dot seemed like she knew what had happened, but she didn't say anything and helped her unpack her clothes. That evening she finally got to talk with John. She asked him what was happening with him and Yoko, and John said, "Oh, her, nothing, it's not important." Cynthia insisted that they talk and stop pretending that nothing was happening. She said they talked more than they ever had, their failings and faults. their love for each other. They also talked about the hopes and dreams. He talked about his other women and said that Yoko was no more important than they had been. He said he loved her, and he loved her now more than ever before. Then they went to bed and made love, and she felt a little better, but it wasn't going to be easy to forget what had happened. Later, Cynthia realized that John had never totally given up drugs, even when he said he did, after meeting the Maharishi. Cynthia's mother had found some hidden LSD while Cynthia and John were in India, and she flushed it down the toilet. So John was mad when he found out, but if he confronted her about it, it would be admitting that he was still taking drugs. So they had some more talks. Cynthia and John had a few more honest conversations during the time. He said he wanted to explore different adventures and avenues, and Cynthia knew that she couldn't share that with him. She was the same happy person she'd always been. She was happy being a mother, wife, and being at home. John had changed a lot and was going in new directions, and they agreed they wanted to stay together despite the differences. That soon changed a little while later when Cynthia said, could she go to New York with him and Paul because they had business there, and John said no. And then he got irritable and withdrawn again. Cynthia asked if she and her mom and Julian could go to Italy for 2 weeks. Well, that didn't sound like too good a good idea to me, and in hindsight, Cynthia thought maybe she should have stayed home rather than leaving him alone in the house. So Cynthia saw Magic Alex there and wondered what he was doing in Italy. He said he had a message from John saying he wanted a divorce, and he was going to take Julian away from her and send her back to Hoy Lake. She thought it was cruel of John to send his lapdog to tell her because he couldn't do it himself. But she knew one thing, she wasn't going to give up Julian. While she was in Italy recovering from being sick and unable to travel, she got a look at the newspaper, and it showed John and his new love, Yoko, hand in hand. Yoko was married at that time, too, to her second husband. John and his request for divorce. Cynthia got a letter stating John was suing her for divorce on grounds of adultery, stating she had been with a guy named Roberto who had escorted Cynthia and a waitress friend she had met while there. She said Roberto was a friend and she had never been unfaithful to John. She felt it was his attempt to feel better about what he had been doing. Would she next be accused of having an affair with Alex? She knew that Alex wanted to stay in John's favor, and she wondered how John could do that to her when she loved him so much. She had thought he was a decent person, but now she lost respect for him. Her mother called Cynthia's brother, and he got a lawyer. Then Cynthia called Peter Brown, and he was apologetic and embarrassed. He told her, "I'm sorry, Cyn. This shouldn't be happening." He said he would arrange a meeting between her and John. A few days later, Peter called her and said John didn't want to see her. He said that Cynthia and Julian could move back to the house, and John and Yoko would move into the London flat. The housekeeper Dot was there when she was ready to say how she felt. She said it was disgraceful carrying on with that woman under Cynthia's roof, and John had given Alex a white Mercedes. Somehow, Cynthia felt lonely without John there, and Julian missed him too. So a meeting is held with John. Peter Brown called to say that John would speak to her. Cynthia's mom was living with her, and the housekeeper was there, and they nervously awaited John's arrival, and then he showed up with Yoko, and they were both dressed in black. Cynthia's mom was fuming. She wanted to go in the room with Cynthia and talk to them. She said, "How dare that woman come? What's the matter with you, John?" The housekeeper had to hold her back. Cynthia said she could face him alone. So Cynthia didn't recognize John. He was thinner, even though it had been a few weeks ago. He wasn't smiling. He didn't seem like himself. And Yoko was sitting beside him, having no expression on her face. He asked her coldly, what did she want to see him for? Cynthia told him, "You know I haven't been unfaithful to you." He said she was no innocent flower. So Yoko went into the kitchen and asked for a glass of water, and Cynthia's mother told her to get out of the house, get out of their lives, and she asked if she had any shame. She said she was breaking everybody's hearts. John suggested she was having an affair with a Yankee cowboy in India. She thought who would be next in line as her lover, the elderly gardener. John claimed the guy, that Yankee cowboy, had written Cynthia a letter and gave it to George to give to her, but instead he gave it to John. So Cynthia said what was in the mysterious letter, and he didn't tell her. Cynthia wanted to talk things over, but John had enough and said they could talk through their lawyers. She knew he was cutting himself off from her and Julian emotionally because it was the only way to get through the separation. Cynthia stayed awake all night and finally came up with she was going to countersue, citing adultery with Yoko. John had cut her off from the whole Beatles family, but one day Paul came to visit. Paul brought her a single red rose and said how sorry he was and he didn't know what had come over him. He said he'd been bringing Yoko to the recording studio, and the other Beatles didn't like it. He joked to Cynthia, saying that they should get married. He cheered her up, and he was the only Beatle not afraid to defy John. When Yoko got pregnant, it proved that John and Yoko were having an affair at the time John was accusing Cynthia of having her affairs. So she saw John and Yoko once more in the lawyer's office to sign divorce papers. John barely looked at her or spoke to her, and when he left the room to go to the bathroom, Yoko followed him. A few minutes later, Cynthia went into the hallway, and Yoko was standing outside the bathroom waiting for him. John came out, and as they passed by, he said, "See, I don't go anywhere without Yoko." He agreed that that Cynthia should have custody of Julian. The lawyers probably told him he would be unlikely to get it. And John hadn't seen Julian for a few months, so she wondered when he would visit with him. They agreed on a settlement, and Cynthia couldn't believe he was being so mean. She said she should have hated John for what he put her through, and she was angry and very hurt. But she still couldn't hate him. She still loved him. And Cynthia felt that John was more and more obsessed, and he didn't think about those that he had been closest to that went for family and friends. He took himself seriously, and he wasn't the John they had known. Cynthia had worried that John and Yoko might want to try to get a custody battle with her the same way they had done with Yoko's husband over her daughter. Instead, he abandoned Julian. John and Yoko went to live in the United States. They got tired of the British press and the public's hate for Yoko. And then the irony. Cynthia kept thinking that she and John could be civil with each other, especially because of the child they shared together. But John refused to speak to her. She called John, and Yoko answered and said that her and John thought it better if Yoko spoke to Cynthia and John would speak to her ex regarding the kids. Well, Cynthia got a backbone then and said she wasn't willing to talk to Yoko exclusively, and if John wanted to see Julian, he could call her himself. She said John had just released a song called Imagine, an anthem for peace, wanting the world to live as one, but he didn't want peace with her. And it was 3 years before he saw Julian again. So Julian felt the neglect, saying, "Dad's always telling people to love each other, but how come he doesn't love me?" He not only neglected Julian, he also cut off ties with family and friends in Britain. Cynthia was asked if she had known from the beginning what would happen if she would have gone through with it, and she had to say no. She never regretted having Julian, but she said if she'd have known what falling for John Lennon would lead to, she would have turned around and walked away. John never knew what a marriage should be like because he never saw his own parents together and happy. And you would think that if you saw that happen, you would work hard to do things differently. It doesn't seem to work out that way usually. But one good thing that happened was that John and his son seemed to be a little closer before he died. Julian got to see his father, and he saw that his father did love him. He just had a funny way of showing it. So I hope everyone enjoyed the video, and if you did, if you could give it a thumbs up, that would be great. Thanks to all of you who have subscribed to the channel. It means a lot to me. And tune in again soon for another episode of The Beatles Forever. Thank you. Bye.